I'm Anjali Kimlani, and I am here to speak with a special guest, CEO of Moderna, Stéphane Bancel, about all things COVID and the vaccine, as well as more tied to the JPM Annual Health Conference. Stéphane, thanks again for joining us today. It's been a while since we spoke, but we clearly have a lot of catching up to do. Omicron is now here and has completely ruined our plans to have this chat in person. So let's talk about that first. The vaccine, right now we're looking at sort of starting the discussions of a fourth dose here in the US, but I know that you have been focused on an Omicron specific booster as well. Talk to me about what you're thinking in terms of how we need to continue fighting this virus.
Well, good morning, and thank you for the invitation. I would start by saying first, let's look at the short term. I think we need to make sure as many people can get the booster as possible. As you know, through real-world evidence, there's very strong data coming, including from the UK, showing that people who got 3 Moderna doses are extremely well protected against the Omicron variants. We see very high efficacy against infection, person to person, in the short term. And we see very strong protection against hospitalization and deaths. Actually, just Singapore just came out with very interesting data showing Moderna is the best weapon to protect against deaths, against any other vaccines. So that's for where we are today. So people who don't have a booster, please go get your booster. If you know people not vaccinated, please make sure they get vaccinated. So as we look forward, we need to be ready for whatever evolution gives us. And so we are working on a lot of different boosters in the clinic as we speak. We should get the Omicron specific booster in the clinic in the coming weeks, but we also have an alpha and a beta and a delta booster in the clinic. And we're also going to look at combinations and discussing with public health leaders like in the US, UK, Europe, and around the world to figure out what product do they want to be ready for the fall of 2022. We're very blessed that in 21, we just announced we shipped 807 million doses. 25% of those doses went to low-income and middle-income countries, which is wonderful. And that translates into around $17.5 billion of sales for 21. One of the things we did this morning is actually increase our expectations for sales for 22. On our November 4th quarterly call, we had said we had already signed contracts with down payments for $17 billion. For 2022. And we had options for up to $3 billion. This morning, we are upgrading those numbers. What we have now is signed APAs for $18.5 billion. Recently, the UK and Switzerland and South Korea placed large orders for the fall of 2022. And the options have now gone up to $3.5 billion. But what is important to know is there are still a lot of discussions ongoing for the fall of 2022. And the numbers I gave is very heavily tilted toward the first half of the year. So many more discussions to come as governments get ready for 22. And already some countries have already signed orders for 23, like the UK and Taiwan, who wants to make sure they get secured their supply.
Absolutely. And this definitely falls in line with what you've told us repeatedly, which is that 2022 was really where you're going to see that ramp up of supply. And I'm glad you brought up the low and middle income countries, because I feel like that's something that we haven't quite addressed as much. There have been discussions about either vaccine hesitancy on the ground or the inability to absorb specifically mRNA vaccines. What has been your experience and what do you think Moderna can do to really help improve the situation? As we've seen, there still is a need to vaccinate the world.
Sure. So if you look at vaccinating low-income countries, there's 2 pieces of the problem. There's the supply of vaccines, and then there's the ability to get doses in arms. So the supply of vaccine, clearly in the first half to maybe up to September of 2021, there was a supply issue. Every country wanted vaccine to protect their people, and there was not enough supply for the planet. But this has changed drastically. In the fall, we really saw a total switch going from undersupply to oversupply of vaccines, including for low-income countries. In November, for example, in any given day of the week, we had between 50 and 100 million doses sitting in a warehouse, waiting to be shipped to low-income countries via COVAX. And we announced this morning in our press release that the African Union has announced to us last week that they do not want their Q2 reservation, which was for 60 million doses. they do not need it. They informed us that between the COVAX supply, the Chinese donation, the US government donation, the EU donations, they have more vaccine than they need to get them in arms. But the challenge they have is getting them in arms. They don't have enough nurses, doctors, vaccination centers. As you know, transportation is an issue for people that are in remote areas. So I think we need to do much more as a world to help for the last mile, getting doses in arms. It is not anymore a problem of doses. If you look at what the industry has done, it is really remarkable. We are now moving to a situation where we have more doses available than people wanting vaccines, which is a great place to be. And the mRNA vaccines are really showing their difference through real-world evidence. Again, Singapore last week showed that the vaccine that best protects against death is the Moderna vaccine. And if you look at the high-income country, it's mostly an mRNA market.
Right, absolutely. And to that point, you're also setting the stage for more absorption of mRNA products with the buildup that you've created now of mRNA manufacturing. So on that point, talk to us about what the outlook is, especially for 22 for Moderna. Beyond the COVID vaccine, you do have a number of other things in the pipeline. Do we see more of that come out? Because it seems like that's something that, specifically for a company like Moderna, that investors would be really interested in.
Sure. I mean, I always remind people that while the COVID-19 vaccine is very important for the pandemic, it's very important in terms of sales, 17.5 billion last year, as I said, already 18.5 signed for this year, plus the option, plus more discussions ongoing. It's a very important product, no doubt. But mRNA is an information molecule. Moderna has built a platform. For 10 years, we were capital constrained. Well, we finished 2021 with $17 billion of cash. And so if you think about it, we announced this morning that in terms of investment, for example, we invested in 2019 pre-pandemic $500 million in R&D. Well, guess what? This year, our plan is to invest $2.5 to $3 billion. That's 5 to 6x more investment. And we have now 40 programs in development. And there are many more in the labs that are going to move into development from the labs. In CapEx, we invested less than $100 million in 2019. Well, this year, we're going to invest around $800 million. So it's kind of over 8x increase in capital investment, a plant in Canada, a plant in Australia, a plant in Africa, more investment in the US. And so people, I think, don't appreciate where Moderna is going. We have a platform. In this industry, there's never been a platform. As you follow the field, when you have a company getting one product to market, everybody's scratching their heads, okay, what's the next product? Well, Moderna has 40 in development. Very excited about flu combining with COVID. One single dose a year, you get your COVID booster, adapted to the variant of a year, you get your flu booster, adapted to also the strain of flu of that year. And then we will keep adding components. There are around 10 viruses that cause hospitalization because of infecting people in their respiratory system. And we want just to stop that. We believe the world deserved a single annual shots that protect you against those 10 viruses so people don't get sick, don't get hospitalized, and don't die of respiratory virus. We are, in 2022, people should not be dying of respiratory viruses. The technology exists, and Moderna will not stop until we have that broad protection for people all around the world.
The Omicron variant, the race is heating up to get vaccines distributed across the globe. Novavax is the latest to file for emergency use authorization of its protein-based vaccine in 10 new regulatory agencies. The vaccine, which has already been shipped out to Europe, has also been approved for emergency use by the WHO and agencies in India, the Philippines, and Indonesia. Let's bring in Novavax CEO Stanley Erck joining us as part of JP Morgan's annual healthcare conference. We've also got our very own Anjali Kamlani joining in on the conversation. Stanley, always good to have you on the show. I know the last time we spoke, we talked about this authorization and what specifically it means for Novavax to have this vaccine out there, especially as we continue to see these cases from the Omicron variant. How does this vaccine change the landscape in terms of how we tackle this latest surge?
Well, I think a lot. I think that you note that we have shipped our first product to Europe. We've actually shipped our first product to Indonesia. We shipped 10 million doses. We focused on low and middle income countries first. And we are now actually vaccinating people, which is a terrific feeling. And I think that all is going to happen is going to accelerate over the coming couple of quarters. The hard part is you have to balance in this first quarter as you're launching and you're trying to get product globally and trying to get it to low and middle income countries at the same time you're trying to fulfill other obligations. It'll be a little bit rocky at first, but it's going great right now. And so the production sites have scaled up and we're starting to make lots and lots of product.
I want to touch on that, Stan. Can you fill us in a little bit about that ramp up, and maybe a number on how many doses per month you're anticipating, throughout the year as you continue, especially as we know that you're suddenly met with all of this demand at a time when people didn't necessarily expect you would.
Well, we are. We expected we would, and what we expected is starting to happen. We were on track to do what we have said we would do, which is to get to the point where we can make a couple billion doses this year. So we're at a rate in this quarter of over 200 million doses per month by the end of this quarter, and that's going to satisfy a lot of this demand. But the markets, the market for primary vaccination, 2-dose vaccination, which is now being talked about as 3-dose vaccination, is unsatisfied. There are 30 to 40 in high-income countries. There are 30% of the people are not vaccinated, and in low and middle-income countries, it's a lot bigger. And in fact, when you're talking about a 3rd dose and perhaps a 4th dose boosting, 90% of the world's population haven't had that yet. So we've got a lot of work to do ahead of us, but we're on track to do it.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up, especially as we talk about sort of resetting those numbers of vaccinated, if you do consider the 3 doses fully. One of the things that we've seen other companies run into on the ground is, especially for low-income countries, the struggle with logistics, especially for the mRNA ones. There's a different requirement for cold storage. Have you already had discussions, and do you already have a solid plan to be able to get those injections in arms, considering the struggle that there is?
We do. There are over 1 billion doses of vaccine distributed throughout the world, particularly in low and middle income countries. And in a refrigerated, what's called the cold chain process, has been in place for a decade now. That's what we do. We ship at refrigerated temperatures. We use the standard cold chain that's in place. And we have a couple things in our to our advantage. One is that it's simple refrigerated temperatures. Number 2, it's stable. We've got a stability of 9 months instead of 6 months, and that helps a lot in the distribution chain. And then finally, we ship it in a vial that's all pre-mixed. You don't have to do anything to it. You just stick a needle in, and it's all pre-formulated. So a lot of benefits to our vaccine in distribution.
Stan, Zach here. Thanks again for coming on. I mean, when we talk about kind of the roles that now each one of these vaccine makers is going to have to play, it does seem like, Novavax stepping into the fold here across the globe is going to be rather important when it comes to equality in getting them into the arms of everybody across the globe. A lot of experts have been saying that that's really kind of the reason why we saw Omicron spread as quickly as it did, was because global vaccination rates are so low. I mean, would you say that it's fair to call Novavax now, as it steps into the fold, maybe the most important player in really getting this under control?
Well, I'm of course not unbiased, but I do believe that's true. For all the reasons that I just stated before, I think it's true. We're going to make a significant impact on this COVID pandemic, and we have the right vaccine to do that. The other vaccines have done really spectacular breakthroughs in getting to the marketplace, but there's a void, and we're going to fill that void. It's not exclusively low and middle income countries, because high income countries need this. We need to get past the vaccine hesitancy. We need to get boosters that are safe and efficacious, and we have data to show that ours does exactly that.
Stan, I want to talk about that safety part of it. After hitting the market, we saw each vaccine company, one after another, hit certain concerns. Do you have any insight right now, or do you have any things that you're looking for that you might have considerations of as the vaccine gets rolled out into the market, and a backup plan or a plan of action in case you do see some safety concerns?
Well, we have what we call a benign safety profile. There's a couple of things you think about. One is tolerability, how much local and systemic reactions there are, and how long they last. And I think we have the best tolerability profile there is. Safety, to be fair, we don't have tens of millions of doses out there yet, and so you don't have the opportunity to see what rare or infrequent events there are. We haven't seen any or much, and our label will reflect that. But we have a very standard protein-based vaccine that has so far proven safe in not only COVID, but we've used it in flu and we've used it in malaria. So we're pretty confident.
Stan, there's a sense right now that there's a bit of re-rating, a resetting of expectations on COVID and kind of learning to live with it. Once you get the infection, it's not just about a complete isolation, a complete shutdown anymore. The CDC changes guidelines. We even heard from the Fed chair today saying that businesses are just kind of learning to live with these waves. As it stands right now, how do you think Americans should be thinking about this? We've heard that inevitably there could be another variant. We could see more surges. Is this kind of that transition? We always expected this being endemic instead of a pandemic. Talk to me about how we should be resetting our expectations for the next year, let's say.
Well, first of all, I think you should continue to listen to the public health experts, because I'm not a public health expert. I'm the CEO of a biotechnology company. But obviously, we think about these things and we try to plan forward for how our vaccine is going to be used over time. So we've done that. I think I've described our current vaccine and how it's going to be used during the pandemic. And as we transition to maybe more flu-like endemic, we actually have a clinical trial going on that we started 6 months ago that it combines our flu vaccine, which we think could be the world's best flu vaccine, we hope, and our COVID vaccine, so that you can boost on an annual basis or semi-annual basis. And data will tell us how frequently we're going to need to vaccinate with COVID. But we believe that we have a repertoire of respiratory vaccines that we think that we can combine and use as a single shot as this transitions to an epidemic.
Our Anjali Kamlani is here with us and with a special guest, Albert Bourla, who is the CEO of Pfizer. Anjali, take it away.
Thank you, Julie, and hello to Albert. Thank you again for joining us today. I know that you and I were both looking forward to possibly seeing each other in person this time, but unfortunately, Omicron got in the way. I want to start off with talking about that actually, and just the impact that you're seeing. We know that here in the U.S. that we've had discussions about boosters coming this fall, and we're watching the Omicron wave really surge in certain parts of the country as well as the world. Tell me what you're seeing in terms of the potential for, possibly changing how we look at boosters and what kinds of boosters you anticipate. I know you're working on an Omicron specific booster as well right now. So what's at stake for us in fall of 22?
Clearly, the situation has been deteriorated because of the Omicron. We had a very quick ramp up. It is a disease that manifests a little bit less in terms of mildness. I mean, it's more mild, but because of the high infectious rates, still the hospitals in absolute numbers are going much higher in terms of severe disease, ICUs, occupation, etc., etc. So, and we know that the 2 doses of the vaccine offer very limited protection, if any. The 3 doses with a booster, they offer reasonable protection against hospitalization and deaths. Against deaths, I think very good. And less protection against infection. Now, we are working on a new version of our vaccine, the 1.1, let me put it that way, that will cover Omicron as well. And of course, we are waiting to have the final results. The vaccine will be ready in March, and the vaccine will be able to produce it massively. We need to see if we will need it, and we need to see if and what place can take in the overall fight against the virus, particularly now that we know that mutations are coming faster, but we have a treatment. So all of that needs to be taken seriously into consideration. But we've never had more weapons on our box too.
Absolutely. And Pfizer, of course, taking the lead with that. I know that you've expanded, of course, your collaborations on that front, especially with BioNTech for mRNA. But I want to quickly talk about the kids vaccine before we get to that. I know that right now, there's a lot of parents waiting for that under 5 to come out. And the company has said that it's going to need to be a 3-dose vaccine. Do you see that to be the case for adults as well, especially as we see that while you do offer really strong protection, the waning immunity is an issue because it wanes pretty quickly?
Yes. First of all, I don't have any doubts that this is also for adults a 3-dose vaccine. And I think this is what basically every health authority in the world is recommending right now. Now, the question is if we will need, let's say, annual boosters or not, but this is a 3-doses vaccine, particularly for the adults. What was the second question that you asked, Annalise?
Sorry, for the kids, the update on the timeline there, knowing that, there's so many parents waiting for that under 5. Do you have an updated timeline on when we can see that?
I think things will move fast. We are collecting right now data from the 3rd dose. We are having already data from the 2nd dose because 2 doses in younger kids is different than in adults. We are in discussions with FDA, and we will submit everything to them. I hope that things can move very, very fast. Actually, not in months, in a few weeks.
Sure. Yeah, we're all waiting for that for sure. And when you're talking about, the treatments are also out there, but we also still need to meet global needs for vaccines. I know you've repeatedly said that you have had refusals for the vaccines. There's also vaccine hesitancy as an issue, especially in lower and middle income countries. Is that still the situation now? Have you found a change after you started shipping more towards the end of last year?
Oh, yes. First of all, let's put some statistic out there. In 2021, we had said that we would produce approximately 3 billion doses, and we did. We released 3 billion doses, from which 2.6 billion approximately were shipped to countries. Among those 2.6, 1 billion was shipped to middle and low-income countries, so 38%. So that's what we had promised, and this is what we had delivered. Now, what is the situation, particularly for the lower income of this range? Right now, we have more than they can absorb, unfortunately. And I think all the efforts of the WHO, of UNICEF, of philanthropic organizations like Gates, Doctors Without Medicines, and us should be in one, fighting the misinformation in these countries and creating a vaccine advocacy and support, because people are hesitant to do it in higher numbers than in the high-income countries. But also there is a lack of infrastructure. Sometimes it's difficult even to carry the vaccine to a vaccination center. We worked with a project to carry them with drones that was very successful. The drones could carry in these low temperatures the vaccines, but we didn't have where to take them eventually because they are not operating vaccination centers in the rural parts of the country. So all of these are issues that needs to be addressed, and that should be the focus of everyone right now.
Definitely, and to that point, absolutely. And to that point, the mRNA really being a newer technology for these countries to absorb, that has been part of the issue. I know that you created that agreement with South Africa, the BioVac Institute, and with the sort of investment that you're making in mRNA right now, expanding that agreement with BioNTech, that partnership, and moving into other vaccines. Do you see this as more of a long-term play? And do you see maybe resolving some of those transportation logistical issues as part of your work there?
Yes, I think the transportation and logistical issues that are related with the nature of our vaccine at large have been addressed. Right now, we are able to produce a new formulation that can stay 2.5 months in normal refrigeration, so like every other vaccine. So I don't think this is the issue. The issue is that there are not people to inject There's no healthcare practitioners. There is not a center to receive it so that people can come. And very importantly, people are not queuing outside to get a vaccine because they don't believe in that. So these are the issues mainly that needs to be addressed. As regards the investments that we are doing in the area, it's not only on the COVID vaccine, but clearly we are investing a lot to make sure that we make better vaccines. The Omicron one, a vaccine that can cover Omicron in addition to everything else is, for example, a good example. But we are also working, we just announced 3 new deals today. One is with Beam Therapeutics that is trying to harness the power of mRNA in gene editing. The other is with Codex, which will potentially allow us to reduce the time in manufacturing of RNA from 1 month, which is the part that takes now to make the DNA, to maybe a few days. Very, very important. And the other is licenses from Acuitas, LNP, 10 targets of LNP. LNP is the technology that uses lipid nanoparticles to transfer RNA to our tissue. So we truly believe that the mRNA technology is very powerful. It's not the holy grail, but it is very powerful. We are just scratching the surface. And we are very, very well positioned to put together capabilities of others and ourselves to produce medicines that the world needs.
Absolutely. And speaking of medicines that the world needs, we also see the antiviral, making its way throughout the world. Production of that still ramping up and deliveries as well. So while supplies are constrained for right now, do you see that impacting the pandemic and sort of the way that people have been anticipating, especially because it's coming a little bit after this Omicron spread?
I think it's coming, I wish we had it in larger quantities, but it came exactly the moment that you need it. I think it's a game changer. It is a game changer because we know that people are getting way more sick. First of all, there are unvaccinated people that they are getting hospitalizations. There are people that new variants don't protect, and clearly Omicron is not going to be the only variant that exists there, and this wave is not going to be the only wave that we are facing, unfortunately, but this is the reality. The virus is endemic almost all over the world, and also both the natural infection and vaccinations, they don't produce lasting immunity against this virus. It's not that the vaccines that they have it is the virus that has these characteristics. As I said, even the natural infection produces even smaller, less durable immune responses. And so the virus will be here for many, many years. And we're lucky that we have pills and vaccines of high effectiveness so that we can control it and go back to normal lives, which is the given right now.
Right, absolutely. We're all looking forward to that.
Right now. This is what everybody's asking. Go back to normal life.
And here to discuss is Ruth Dilber, AstraZeneca Biopharmaceuticals President, and Yahoo Finance's Anjali Khemlani. Thank you so much for being here, both of you. And sir, if I could start with you, congratulations on the authorization. So explain to me, this is first of its kind in the US, and it is a preventative. So people take it before they're actually exposed to any form of COVID. So how does it work? And then how quickly do you think this rolls out?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me in your show. First of all, it's for the first time that we have now a long-acting antibody cocktail. So it consists of 2 antibodies. They will bind to the spike protein of COVID-19, and as a consequence, the COVID-19 virus cannot infect patients. It's particularly for those vulnerable patients who are immunocompromised. And you can think about patients with blood cancer, patients with organ transplant. All those patients need an additional layer of protection. So it's for the first time that there's now an antibody for the prevention of that. There's a high need for those patients. And equally, we are very happy to report that in the next few weeks, we will roll out a quite extensive number of doses already in the United States. The US government has purchased more than 700,000 doses from us. So we are now in the process in order to make it ready so it can be sent to the US government for further distribution.
Ruud, Anjali here, really great to speak with you again. I want to touch on the sort of patient population that you're looking at, because there are also individuals who've been waiting for an alternative to existing vaccines, either because they're afraid of the side effects or they've already experienced pretty severe side effects. And when it comes to the idea of maybe a booster, they may not be as willing. Does this work in that situation, or is that not recommended?
So it's officially not recommended by the FDA. The FDA has been very clear in the label that this long-acting antibody cocktail is for those patients who are immunocompromised, or for those people who cannot get the vaccine because of an allergic reaction. So it's clearly not meant for people who want to have an alternative for vaccines. Vaccines remain the cornerstone in the fight against COVID-19. And the numbers we are talking about here regarding the availability of doses is simply much lower than it is the case for vaccines. In the United States, just to give you a number, there are roughly 7 million immunocompromised patients across different groups. Once again, organ transplant patients, blood cancer patients, patients with an immunocompromised system like MS. That's the primary target population for this new medicine.
Ruud, Alexis here. Thanks so much for being with us. I know that this is all happening quickly and in real time, but any idea what this antibody cocktail is like in terms of efficacy when it comes to the Omicron variant?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Let me summarize by saying we are hopeful. We are hopeful based on the genetic data. Once again, the antibody cocktail consists of 2 very strong binding antibodies against COVID-19. And based on our initial research, we are very hopeful that it will be protective. Having said that, the scientists need to confirm that in the next 1 to 2 weeks, but it looks good so far.
Ruud, I want to quickly touch on the global vaccination efforts. Obviously, with Omicron, a really big focus right now. Can you update us on sort of how Astrazeneca is responding to this when it comes to global donations and finding avenues to make sure there are more shots in arms?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. We're very proud. As we speak, we have supplied more than 2.2 billion doses around the world. And of course, that's very important because we are now one of the largest manufacturers in the world, together with Sinovac, a Chinese vaccine, and the mRNA vaccine of Pfizer. So we are really proud about our internal efforts in order to make this vaccine available to so many people in the world. Because as we know, if we want to get out of this terrible pandemic, we need to make sure that we vaccinate as soon as possible, as much as possible as well, patients or people around the world. So therefore, our efforts are continuing. Just to give you a sense, we're now producing roughly, together with our partners, 300 million doses a month. So you see that the production is up and running, and we will continue to do that moving into 2022 as well.
And Ruud, I want to ask you really quickly, I don't know, this is my hypothesis. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but it seems like COVID is going to be here for definitely at least the near future, right, over the next couple of years. And definitely we will then see more sort of mutations like we're seeing now with this Omicron variant. So does that mean that you have to change the cocktail antibody mix that you are creating for people? How often do you need to sort of revise and revisit this? And then how quickly are you able to scale if you do need to change the mix?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, from a vaccine perspective, I think it's fair to say that it is slightly easier to adjust the vaccine for potentially new variants. For the antibody cocktail, it depends on the mutation. If the mutation is completely different from what it is today, then it can still take quite some time, up to 6 months at least. But equally, we have seen that our current cocktail, is very effective against most of the variants. And once again, I really hope that it is also true for the Omicron variant, and we will know that relatively soon. But we can expect more more variants coming into the population. And of course, that's a concern, but equally, I can guarantee you that all manufacturers are on top of that. And if necessary, we try to adjust both the vaccine and in our case, also our long-acting antibody cocktail as quickly as possible.
Ruud, absolutely. On that Omicron point, definitely just pivoting back to the vaccines for a second, we saw the report, of course, of the expired doses to Nigeria. I know that largely speaking, once it leaves your facilities, it's really in the hands of the countries. What actions can AstraZeneca really take to ensure that more timely deliveries are coming to, especially countries that have not yet finished even their primary courses?
Yeah, and that's a fair question. We try to work extremely close with governments around the world. AstraZeneca specifically is working primarily with organizations like COVAX and Gavi and CEPI. So those are international, well-known organizations in order to make sure that the distribution is taking place in a timely manner. But sometimes there are logistical reasons that it takes sometimes too long in certain countries to get the doses into the arms of the people. And once again, we put all our efforts behind it in order to accelerate that so that people can enjoy a safe and effective vaccine.
Joining us right now is the Global Head of Research and Development at Janssen, Mathai Mammen, and also Anjali Kamlani, our health correspondent here at Yahoo Finance. Both of you, welcome. And Mathai, welcome. I wanted to ask you, the announced split that's coming up in 18 to 24 months with J&J going pharmaceutical and then their consumer division going another separate route, what kind of impact might that have on Janssen and its mission?
Yeah, so the overall separation of the company into the consumer health company and the new Johnson & Johnson that focuses on pharmaceuticals and medical device is very likely highly healthy for both organizations, both future organizations. As far as the impact on what we do within Janssen or Janssen R&D, it's thought to be quite minimal. If anything, it might be positive in that the energy and attention of the senior-most leadership is on two companies rather than one, or two sectors rather than three. And so there's a focus advantage that I see in the coming couple of years, but no meaningful impact on the kind of work we do, how we think of business development, the financials, the firepower that we have for deals. Nothing negative. If anything, it's slightly positive.
Mathai, Anjali here. I know that, in the discussions of the split, a lot of attention has been focused on the fact that the pharmaceutical arm plus medical devices is going to be retain the Johnson & Johnson name. Why not Janssen? Why has it been, that Johnson & Johnson is retaining the name, and how does that help with, say, partnerships? Because I know that that's about 50% of how R&D works.
Yep. The Johnson & Johnson RemainCo, the pharmaceutical and medical device, will retain the name Johnson & Johnson. There are a lot of considerations around naming, and we're perfectly happy with that. We don't think that would make any difference to us right now, that it would be called Johnson & Johnson. But it's actually nice to keep the name because it's what everyone's been accustomed to.
Well, what about the pipeline itself? Medical devices, obviously being one part of that. I know that there's been a lot of discussion, especially lately, around remote monitoring and those kinds of devices. Is Johnson & Johnson looking at that, just looking, with the consumer sort of concept in mind?
Yeah, it's a great question, Anjali. So within the pharmaceutical research and development realm, that part of the organization, COVID's been really interesting in that it's offered up acceptability and acceleration of a number of technologies. You spoke or mentioned monitoring. That would be one example. Telehealth has exploded over the period of COVID. And that's allowed us to think more seriously and accelerate into existing strategies that have patients spoken with or contacted in their homes rather than come and drive onto sites. That extends from conversations you can have with patients all the way through remote measurements and sending of blood and other kinds of measurements back and forth from where someone lives. So the idea for us is to bring the trial to the patient rather than have the patient always come to the trial. And the net benefit of that is faster enrollment, because it's more palatable to patients not to have to leave their home or take days off work, and therefore getting medicines faster ultimately to patients.
Matthias, speaking of the pipeline, some future R&D investments, and when you grow your footprint in this space, I guess, how are you looking to do that? Because I know you made some strategic acquisitions in the past. Is this a pathway that you think would make sense for the company going forward?
Yeah, so we have been and will continue to be open to any source of innovation. The hardest thing is to actually have a molecule or a protein that actually has a tremendously useful benefit to a patient. So sometimes that's invented by our own scientists. Sometimes that's invented by the large ecosystem of biotech and biopharmaceutical companies. And we are a very active player within that ecosystem. We know all the innovators, entrepreneurs, investors. We have a very powerful team internally ourselves. So that allows us to be both discerning, but a humble, participant within this ecosystem and a very attractive partner to companies. So really the answer is we're agnostic as to the source, and we'll pursue anything where we can match up a great biological or a scientific idea to extreme unmet need medically.
Before COVID, my recollection, it was during J&J earnings reports, we would talk about emphasis in research on things like HIV as well as cancer. Will that be the emphasis post-COVID, or are there other developments because of what we're learning about fighting viruses because of the developments just in the last year and a half that would shift the focus of research?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're a broad-based organization. So Janssen R&D is in 6 different therapeutic areas, large, broad therapeutic areas, each of them. So there are very few areas of medicine that we don't touch or are not open to. So, for example, in neuroscience, we're very invested in certain forms of neuropsychiatry. There are many forms of depression, for instance, that have different kinds of biological drivers. And so what we've found is that those subsets are best targeted with novel mechanisms. So that's an example of an area. Also in neuroscience would be Alzheimer's disease. As the immune mechanisms for Alzheimer's now come to the fore, and people start to understand that there's some relationship between your immune system and developing Alzheimer's, we're harnessing that, taking advantage of that to pursue new pathways in Alzheimer's. But I would say there's we always think of this the same way. Is there an idea, a piece of science that's new, a new understanding, a new invention, and does that marry up to an unmet need? And that's irrespective of what areas we're working in. It happens to be that in different periods, there might be more science in certain therapeutic areas. For instance, a few years ago, we saw a lot of innovation in retinal biology. And we saw the opportunity to enter the diseases of the back of the eye that cause blindness. And we've started a whole area right now where we're pursuing medicines that address genetic causes of blindness and other causes of blindness as well.
Majai, before we let you go, talk to us about the impact that COVID has had on the industry. And really, I'm talking about the renewed interest, I think, that a lot of people have in health and keeping themselves healthy after we saw the effect of COVID and how many people have either suffered or unfortunately has lost their life. How big of an effect do you see COVID having on the industry? And I guess, do you consider this a turning point for pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, so to me, you're right. I think that people, especially if they know friends or loved ones that have lost their life, I think that anyone that's had a tragedy in their own life will recognize that one can't take health for granted. And so there has been a refocusing of taking care of oneself, of making sure one is checked out by physicians, one is, following through on issues if they're raised with that person. I think for the healthcare industry, that's a good thing. It's good to have well engaged, participating patients and that care about their own health. It doesn't mean that the industry will take certain actions that they wouldn't have taken otherwise, but it's a positive thing because it'll raise the potential to achieve our mission, which is to raise the health of all humanity. It'll make it that much more likely.
Healthcare giant Johnson & Johnson said today it will split its consumer business consisting of brands like Aveeno and Tylenol from its pharma and medical device business. Both businesses are very significant in size. J&J expects its pharma and medical device business to bring in $77 billion in sales this year. The consumer business is seen posting sales of $15 billion this year. Joe Wolk is the CFO at Johnson & Johnson and joins us now. Yahoo Finance senior healthcare reporter Anjali Khemlani is here as well. Joe, good to see you here. J&J, founded in 1886. Did you and the team think about the historical significance of doing this?
Good morning, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here with you. We certainly did. More importantly, the board did. We have a long-standing history, but that history is really earmarked by bold decisions, entering new markets and aligning our business to where those markets are going. We think today's announcement really reflects not only the boldness of Johnson & Johnson, but also the forward-looking nature and the long-term perspective that we have when we manage from year to year. So this is not a decision that was taken into lightly. The historical significance of it within that framework of better than 135 years is something that was top of mind as we contemplated the decision.
Joe, you know this better than anyone. You've been at J&J for a while. There are people that own J&J shares that for decades, and they like the predictability and the stability of the company. I mean, can you assure them that there won't be any distractions as this business is split off over the next 18 months?
Yeah, Brian, that's a great observation. One of the things that's incumbent upon us as senior leaders, whether it be for the new Johnson & Johnson company or the new consumer healthcare company, is to make sure that we deliver on the expectations and the predictability that shareholders expect from us. We had messaged some of that predictability with respect to our dividend policy going forward. We don't plan to change that. We intend to have a strong investment-grade credit profile for both new companies, and we're going to invest for the long term. So I think those predictable elements that shareholders of Johnson & Johnson have become familiar with over the years will continue to be intact. But we see this very much as moving towards new market trends. If you think about the innovation that's happening across all three of our businesses, it's happening in very different ways. The new Johnson & Johnson company, comprised of pharmaceutical and medical devices, is heavily regulated. It has a physician and patient type of dialogue when decisions are made. In the consumer space, healthcare and good health has kind of come to the forefront through the pandemic, where everyone realizes that in order to avoid the consequences of a pandemic, being healthier is probably one of the best preventative measures we can take. People are much more interested in healthcare, but they're making decisions more independently than maybe relying on the scientific professionals. So with those diverging trends, we think it's really a great opportunity for strategic reasons to split the company up at this point in time. But from a financial perspective, these businesses have never been healthier. If you look at consumer and where they were just 4 or 5 years ago, we had trouble hitting market growth levels, and our margins were well below the peer set. Today, most quarters we are at or above market growth, and our operating margins are right in line with peer set. So the good news there is still maybe more to come. In terms of pharmaceuticals and medical devices, our pharmaceutical business has been a standout now for better than a decade, growing at well above market growth. And the medical device business was really improving their cadence of growth, improving growth year over year heading into the pandemic. We all know what happened last year, and even some of it is happening this year with elective procedures being somewhat deferred. But we think that business is poised to continue its upward momentum trend in 2022. So we think we're very well positioned, and the diversification still resides. If you think about the remaining Johnson & Johnson company, the new Johnson & Johnson, it's still going to be the world's largest, most diversified global healthcare leader.
Joe, I'm so glad you brought that up. And by the way, good to speak with you again. I want to talk about this split and how it's going to impact what we see in future earnings. Because of course, you've been able to sort of buoy if one sector or one section rather is doing worse, in one quarter versus another, and you've been able to look at that long-term growth, and that's where a lot of the stability for the company has come from. Now you're splitting it, so you have a little bit of that riskier pharma side exposed. Are you not worried about that and what it will look like in the future, especially in an environment where drug costs and device costs are so front and center?
Yeah, Anjali, we did think about that specifically in terms of the diversification. We think the little bit of diversification we're giving up here is well offset by the strategic movement for the markets that I just explained, as well as the potential unlocking of value for the consumer health business, as well as our medical device and pharmaceutical businesses. We see a convergence of technologies, and if you think about payers and what they're specifically requesting is certainly lower costs, but also solutions that go from end to end that provide better outcomes for patients, better prognoses based on data. We are very uniquely positioned to deliver that for not only payers and hospital administrators, but for patients as well.
Hey, Joe, it's Julie. You said unlock value a couple of times. Hi. And right now I'm seeing those J&J shares up a little more than 1%, $165 a share. You're a $435 billion, give or take, company. What does unlocking value look like? What do you think? What do you think the stock should be valued at? What does this company look like in terms of how you guys are estimating it, an appropriate valuation?
Yeah, well, Julie, the one thing, I might not know much, but I know that not to predict markets. And we think this is the right strategic decision just based on where market forces are taking these respective businesses. I think the value over time, this will take 18 to 24 months to complete the transaction. And I think over time, investors will get very comfortable with that. We're glad to see the stock is up today, but this announcement wasn't based on a 1 day or a 1 week move in the stock. It's about long-term value.
But to be fair, but if you're talking, sorry to interrupt, but if you're talking about unlocking value, you're saying today that these companies are worth more than where the market is pricing them, right? I mean, that's effectively what you're saying. The market is not pricing it effectively. What is an effective price? Like, what's an appropriate price then?
Yeah, so I think one way to look at this, Julie, is let's look at the new consumer health company and what that could potentially deliver. We've worked closely with banking advisors, and if you just look at consumer peers today, their forward-looking earnings valuations or multiples are around 22 to 25 times earnings. We don't believe we're getting the credit for really a stronger consumer business than what was in place 3 years ago. And so from that perspective, I think that's how the best answer that question in terms of the new consumer business. In terms of having more focus for investors in pharmaceuticals, I think this will put a spotlight on just how significantly stocked our pipeline is going forward, addressing unmet medical needs with our current portfolio, but also new therapies that are cell-based and gene-based. It's very exciting. And then you hold the promise of combining those therapeutics with potentially a device. I think it's very unique to J&J in terms of the capabilities we provide.
Joe, this is Emily here. You were just talking about the benefits and the unlocking of value of this split, but are there any benefits of scale and synergies that exist now between these business units that, especially on the research and development side, that J&J will be losing because of this split?
Yeah, I think, Emily, when you look at the consumer R&D, it's very different than the regulated environment that occurs in medical devices and pharmaceutical. It's much more significant of an investment. And we've not been shy about making R&D investments. Each of the last couple of years, we've increased by close to $1 billion in each of those respective years, improving the percent to sales ratio. Because we are managing for the long term. But it's a very different equation when it comes to innovation. Innovation is clearly important. Good health is clearly important. We want to have scientific basis for the claims that are being made on new J&J as well as the new consumer health company. But it's a very different proposition in terms of just the level of investment when you look at that.
Joe, I can't help but notice that the pharma division is the one that is going to keep the legacy name, and consumer brands, while they are known by sort of their own, they have their own branding, are known independently. And I know you cited e-commerce and the change in distribution to why the consumer sector is going to get a new name. I wonder though, does new branding also help with what has happened, especially with the powder lawsuits and sort of the tarnishing that has happened there?
Yeah, Angeli, I would say that a lot of these brands stand on their own. If you think about Tylenol, Neutrogena, Aveeno, Zyrtec, they're not really associated with Johnson & Johnson's. There is the Johnson's baby that you've mentioned, but that still has a lot of respect throughout the world. And so I think these brands will function perfectly without the Johnson & Johnson backing because they're not really known in that regard.
Johnson & Johnson this morning out with earnings per share that beat estimates, sales falling a little bit short, but the company also raised its forecast for 2022 profit. Let's bring in Joe Wolk. He's Johnson & Johnson Chief Financial Officer. Our Adam Shapiro is with us as well to participate in the conversation. Joe, I want to talk to you first about that forecast, because when we look at the third quarter and the earnings per share beat there, I know some of it had to do with a little bit lower cost, some of it had to do with a lower tax rate. As you look ahead to that full year raise, tell me some of the driving factors behind that.
Sure, Julie. Nice to be with you here today. And just really to share the results of 136,000 associates across the globe that delivered stellar performance. There's so much ambiguity in the world, but the one thing that seems to remain constant is just our innovative pipeline and how that translates to quarterly results. As I look at the fourth quarter, we're very well positioned. If you think about some of the what have been classified as misses in the morning with respect to our top line, it really was timing delays. So half of it is in the area of COVID-19 vaccine, where shipments have been made, but it's really just revenue recognition and following correct accounting practices. As you've likely read, our full-year forecast of $2.5 billion still remains intact. That's what we provided in July, and we're doing that all at a not-for-profit basis. The other so-called miss, again, I would say, is in the camp of timing, in that it was elective procedures in medical devices. But we still, despite the Delta variant, some hospital labor shortages and constraints, we were still able to approach 8% growth in the quarter versus last year. So the medical device recovery is very much intact. It's a matter of intensity now. And those procedures that did not get performed in the third quarter will simply come about in the fourth quarter or early next year. So providing a little nice tailwind there. And then from an operating margin standpoint, we were able to have the flexibility to raise our outlook for EPS. And that's in light of investing at R&D at actually a 23% clip better than what we invested in last year, and last year was a record year. So it's close to $2 billion through 9 months of incremental R&D investment, which really bodes well for the second half of this decade.
Hey, Joe, good to see you. I have two questions, one of which is going to get to the R&D issue, but I want to focus in on pharmaceuticals because there's almost $13 billion in sales in the quarter. And I've always noticed U.S. Sales are higher than your international sales. And do your critics point to that fact as part of the evidence we're watching on Capitol Hill to try and lower pharmaceutical prices? What drives that U.S. number? Is it volume, or is it the price that you're charging U.S. consumers for pharma products?
No, Adam, that is strictly volume. And I think it's the way the U.S. healthcare system is set up, where patients and physicians have choice to a much larger degree. Just to give you an idea just how important innovation is to our pipeline and why it's critical in terms of our success equation to have products and medicines that are much better than the current standard of care. In each of the last 5 years, Adam, we've experienced close to a 5% price decrease, yet we continue to deliver above market growth in our pharmaceutical segment because of that innovation. And that 5% is not the cumulative effect over the last 5 years. It's 5% each and every year. Now, we think there is a healthy debate to be had in terms of healthcare costs, specifically around pharmaceuticals, but we think it really lands in the space of copay. We are advocates for a copay cap. If you think about what the industry has experienced over the last 6 years, the average discount and rebate off of gross or list price 6 years ago was about 26%. Today, it's north of 50% for the industry as well as Johnson & Johnson. So the question really has to be, where is that additional discount and rebate going when we see patients going to the pharmacy counter on a monthly basis where they used to pay $10 or $15 in copay, now paying $75 to $100 per month. So we would like to have that and engage in that discussion, presumably if it's based on facts.
Another issue, and you brought up R&D, the billions that you're devoting to research and development, but Dr. Stoffels is going to retire, your chief scientific officer, at the end of December. I realize no one person makes up an entire unit, but he has been instrumental, for instance, in the development of the COVID vaccine. What kind of impact, if any, will it have going forward on the ability to create new pharmaceutical products and bring them to market?
Yeah, well, let's take a moment and just acknowledge the tremendous career and legacy Paul leaves behind. You've appropriately noted the most recent accomplishment and leadership position that he held with respect to the COVID-19 vaccine development, not just here at Johnson & Johnson, but really on the global stage. But let's go back 25 years ago when we were looking for answers on HIV, and Paul was a pioneer in that space. And then he continued to build out the portfolio. I think the best testament to his legacy is just the fact that we are investing the level of R&D that we are putting in today's P&L, quite frankly, because that will pay off in years to come. Paul's assembled a great team of scientific leaders, therapeutic experts, and we continue to firmly believe that what he has started will evolve and grow in the future.
Joseph, inflation continues to surprise a lot of large companies to the upside. How much in terms of price increases have you had to put into effect on consumer products like Tylenol, Motrin, and even Aveeno?
Yeah, Brian, at this point, as you'll see in our P&L, we have not experienced inflation in terms of the cost that we're recognizing in the third quarter. A lot of the product that we made was probably built or manufactured in the first quarter or maybe even the fourth quarter of last year. We have experienced increased freight and distribution cost since the fourth quarter of last year, and we are monitoring inflation for some select commodities across our portfolio and how that may play out. We have not done anything, I would say, extraordinary with respect to price increases onto customers at this point. There may be a time and a place for that. We just haven't come to that conclusion quite yet. And we continue to monitor it as we run into 2022.
Hey, Joe, I want to ask about vaccine sales. $500 million in the quarter, which missed the average estimate. But, again, we talked about your overall sales at about $23 billion. So it's right. On a relative basis, pretty small amount overall. And I was reading some comments by you this morning that said, it's always kind of amusing when your stock trades on vaccine news when it is really not a huge part of your portfolio. But how do you think about the vaccine, especially as we get this news about boosters, about maybe Dr. Fauci saying the J&J shot should have been 2 shots? How do you think about it, not just a snapshot of now, but going forward as part of the J&J portfolio?
Yeah, so Julie, thanks for raising that. I would say I think about it purely in terms of upside. You heard me just in the last couple questions respond with just how strong our business is, and it's that core portfolio of better than $90 billion of revenue across 3 platforms in healthcare that is really making a difference and is a certainty amidst ambiguous times. I would say with the vaccine, we hope it becomes a commercial opportunity. And while we can second guess and say, well, it should have been a 2-shot, I would remind people that we've got 94% efficacy. And the durability that we have, and this is not to take anything away from the competition out there, but the durability is best in class right now. A booster will only serve to extend that durability. Let's remember, too, how the World Health Organization defines kind of the gold standard when it comes to vaccines and ending pandemics. They prefer 1 shot that's efficacious and that's easily transportable. The J&J vaccine met those requirements in each and every instance. So we feel good about the role we've played. And perhaps, Julie, the best way to conclude this particular topic would be just if you look in the developing world, where we've got about 50 million Johnson & Johnson vaccine doses that have been administered thus far. That's at least 3 times the amount of mRNA vaccines combined. So that role of 1 shot is playing a crucial role in ending the pandemic globally.
And Joe, as we start to wrap this up, the company successfully used a legal maneuver, creating two companies and then placing the baby powder issues and liabilities into this second company, which then was taken into bankruptcy. What do you say to the critics of these totally legal maneuvers? What do you say to the critics who would say you can do that legally, but is it the right thing to do for, I think it's like 30,000 plus potential plaintiffs who seek recourse regarding talc?
Yeah. So, Adam, let me start by saying we are firm in our conviction that there's decades of science that prove that talc is safe. It is not harmful to people. There is an established process that you noted was legal, that when companies are facing abusive tort practices, there's this opportunity to resolve claims in an efficient and equitable manner. So we initiated that process with our cosmetic talc claims, both current and future. Now, we believe all the cases lack merit, and quite honestly, a number of judges and juries have come to that same conclusion. In fact, there's only been one case that's been fully adjudicated that's gone against us. That being said, we did establish a $2 billion fund, qualified settlement fund, to satisfy those claims should an independent bankruptcy court or its delegate deem that claims were valid. But ultimately, the bankruptcy court is going to decide this. I think the critics that are coming out now are really plaintiffs' attorneys who are losing an opportunity to play in jackpot justice and take 30 to 40% of the claims that are, quite frankly, frivolous.